There is a piece of folk wisdom that says you learn more from failure than from success. It sounds right. It feels earned. It gives failure a purpose, which makes failure easier to accept. And as a general claim about how the human brain works, this is false. The cultural narrative around failure has become so prevalent that questioning it can sound like arguing against growth itself. But this is not a motivational claim. It's a neuroscientific one. The brain is wired to learn from getting things right. It does not automatically encode what went wrong. If you want to understand how learning actually happens, you begin with this asymmetry. Today's going to get a little scientific. I haven't done one of these in a while. Let's dig in. Hey there, it's me, Core, and you're listening to Exercise and Consistency, from fitness to flourishing. In 2009, Earl K. Miller and his colleagues at MIT's Picower Institute for Learning and Memory published a study that gave researchers their first real-time snapshot of how single brain cells change during learning. Monkeys were trained to look at alternating images and respond correctly for a reward. The researchers tracked what happened inside individual neurons immediately after a correct response versus an incorrect response. The result was clear-cut. When a behavior was successful, brain cells became more finely tuned to what the animal was learning. The neurons physically changed. They sharpened. After a failure, there was little or no change in the brain and no improvement in behavior. Miller put it plainly. Brain cells keep track of whether recent behaviors were successful or not, and they only adjust when the answer is yes. This is neural plasticity in its most selective form. The brain does not treat all feedback equally. It prioritizes success. The signal that says, "that worked," is the one that rewires the circuitry. The signal that says, "that didn't work," passes through without leaving the same structural trace. The ego adds a second layer to this problem. A series of studies by Lauren S. Kreis Winkler and Ayelet Fishbach at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business used a deceptively simple tool called the Facing Failure game. Participants answered multiple choice questions across successive rounds. Feedback from earlier rounds helped them perform better later, and more correct answers meant more money. Across many rounds, people consistently underlearned from failure. Even when the researchers offered a learning bonus 900% larger than the base payment, participants still learned less from failure than from success. The incentive did not matter. The mechanism was not rational. What was happening was emotional. Failure threatens self-esteem. When the ego registers a loss, it triggers a fight or flight response. Fight looks like dismissal. The task was unfair. The feedback was wrong. It doesn't matter anyway. Flight is more common. In flight, the person simply disengages. They stop paying attention. This is the ostrich effect, named for the tendency of investors to stop checking their portfolios when the market drops, while compulsively tracking every gain. The brain protects itself by looking away. There is a chemical reason success teaches and failure does not. When you perform an action that produces a positive outcome, the brain releases dopamine. Dopamine is not a pleasure chemical. It is a learning signal. It tells the neural pathway that produced the successful action to strengthen, to become more likely to fire again in the same configuration. the sequence gets locked in. Failure does not trigger the same signal. There is no equivalent chemical instruction that says, weaken the pathway that produced the error. The brain does not automatically subtract. It only adds, and it adds in response to success. This means that if you want to change a behavior pattern, the mechanism is not eliminating the wrong pattern. It's building and reinforcing the right one until the wrong one atrophies from disuse. None of this means failure is useless. It means failure requires conscious effort to extract value from it, and that effort only pays off under specific conditions. The first condition is observing someone else's failure. When your own ego is not on the line, the brain stays engaged. You can study what went wrong without the threat response shutting down your attention. This is why case studies, postmortems, and watching a more experienced person make a mistake can be genuinely instructive. The second condition is active introspection with a growth mindset. The brain does produce a physical error signal when a mistake occurs. If you override the instinct to disengage and instead manually debug what happened, you can extract the lesson. But this takes deliberate effort. It is not automatic. The third condition is operating outside your comfort zone, but only if you eventually find the correct answer. Making mistakes during difficult practice forces the brain into a state of neuroplasticity. It becomes more flexible, more open to change. But the learning itself still happens when you get it right. The mistake opens the door. The success walks through it. This is where the neuroscience converges with the practice I call the discipline. The discipline is the practice of returning attention to your personal standard of excellence, not dwelling on the miss, not punishing yourself for the miss, not celebrating the miss as if it were inherently instructive. Just returning. Each enacted choice is a fresh opportunity. Who you choose to be is not determined by past failure. Character is the retrospective pattern of past choices. It is never a fixed state. The next rep, the next decision remains entirely open. What the MIT study tells us is that this return of our attention to our standard of excellence is not just philosophically sound, it's neurologically accurate. The learning does not happen in the error. It happens in the correction. The brain changes when you get it right. So the work is not analyzing why you missed the workout. The work is doing the next one. The body is the first honest teacher. When you fail a lift, the signal is immediate and unambiguous. But the signal itself does not make you stronger. What makes you stronger is the successful rep that follows, the one where you adjust, correct, and execute. Exercise is the rehearsal space for this pattern, the simplest domain in which to practice the dichotomy of control. You cannot will the weight to move. You can only will your attention back to the standard and attempt again. If the brain learns from success, then the practical project is straightforward. Structure your practice so that success is frequent. This is why simple exercise, simple practice is not a concession. It's the strategy. You already have access to programs, videos, books, and trainers. What you lack is not a better program. It's the meta skill of consistency. And consistency is built on successful repetitions. not failed ones. Each completed workout, each enacted choice aligned with the standard reinforces the neural pathway that makes the next one more likely. The cultural advice to fail forward gets the sequence wrong. You do not learn from falling. You learn from standing back up. The standing is what the brain records. The standing is what changes you. The falling is just data, a signal that something needs adjusting, nothing more, and nothing that defines who you are. Stop treating failure as if it carries inherent instructional value. It does not. What teaches you is getting it right. Engineer small wins. Return to the standard. Let success do what failure cannot. When you're ready to exercise consistency and become the person who follows through, start your day one inside the ACT Score Challenge. Stack the days and practice the reps that reshape your identity. That's it for today. Catch you next time.